You're lying awake at 2 a.m., listening to rain hammer your roof. Mildly annoying, right? Maybe you grab a blanket, scroll your phone, fall back asleep. Now rewind 50,000 years. You're crouched in a shallow rock shelter. No walls, no door. Just you, your family, and a fire that's the only thing standing between your children and the cold that kills. The rain hasn't stopped in 4 days. Your firewood is soaked. The stream outside has become a river. And somewhere in the dark, a cave hyena is thinking exactly what you're thinking. This shelter looks dry. For us, rain is an inconvenience. For our ancestors, a single bad storm could decide who lived and who didn't. So what did they actually do, trapped for days with nothing but rain, fear, and each other? Rain, for early humans, was never just water falling from the sky. It was 3 overlapping emergencies arriving at once. The first was cold. Wet skin loses heat roughly 25 times faster than dry skin. A soaked, shivering body can slide into hypothermia in hours. Even in temperatures we'd call mild, there was no spare set of dry clothes waiting in a closet. If your only covering got soaked through, you stayed wet until your body heat or a fire dried it out, and sometimes neither happened in time. The second threat was water itself, moving. Flash floods in valleys and low caves could rise with almost no warning, turning a familiar shelter into a death trap in minutes. Archaeological sites have shown sediment layers from sudden flooding events that wiped out camps entirely. Silent evidence of people who simply ran out of time. The third threat had teeth. Storms pushed predators toward the same dry, sheltered spots humans wanted. Overhangs, shallow caves, dense thickets. Cave bear and hyena remains found alongside early human tools in the same shelters suggest these spaces were contested real estate, not peaceful refuges. A family hiding from the rain might find they weren't hiding alone, so a multi-day storm wasn't downtime. It was a slow-motion emergency. Stay warm, stay dry, stay fed, and don't get eaten. All while trapped in one place with no way to leave. Understanding that pressure is the key to understanding everything that came next. Because the choices ancient humans made under that pressure didn't just keep them alive that week. Some of them changed our species forever. If there was one job that outranked every other job during a storm, it was this. The fire could not go out. Modern fire starting takes a lighter or a match. Seconds of effort. For early humans, creating fire from nothing, using friction or sparked stone, could take exhausted, sweat-soaked minutes, even in perfect dry conditions. In driving rain, with damp wood and no dry tinder, starting a fire from scratch might be nearly impossible. So the strategy wasn't start a fire when needed. It was never, under any circumstances, let this one die. This is why archaeological sites repeatedly show something remarkable. Hearths used continuously, layer after layer, for generations. Communities didn't extinguish and relight. They tended, fed, and protected a living flame the way you'd protect a member of the family. Because in a real sense, it was keeping the family alive. Frozen mummified remains from the Alps, dated to around 5,300 years ago, included a fire-starting kit carried as essential travel gear, fungus that smolders slowly, flint, and pyrite. Tools treated with the same seriousness we'd give a phone charger and a first aid kit combined. During a multi-day storm, someone was likely assigned, formally or not, to fire duty, shielding the flame from wind and water, feeding it the driest wood available, often gathered and stored in advance, tucked under overhangs specifically to stay dry for exactly this situation, splitting wood to expose drier inner fibers. This wasn't idle busy work. It was full-time, high-stakes labor, likely rotated among capable adults so no one exhausted themselves into uselessness. The fire gave heat, obviously. But it also gave light in a cave with no windows, protection from animals that fear flame, a place to cook food that would otherwise carry parasites, and, as we'll see, a gathering point for something far more valuable than warmth. Keep that image in mind, a small circle of light, rain hammering just outside it, everyone huddled close. Because that circle is where the next part of the story happens. Here's something worth sitting with. Humans are almost incapable of doing nothing. Trap a person indoors for days with limited stimulation, and their hands start looking for a task. That instinct is ancient. And during storm-bound days, it became one of our species' greatest survival advantages. With hunting and foraging paused by weather, forced stillness became forced productivity. Stone had to be worked into new tools. Scrapers for hides, points for spears, blades for cutting. This wasn't a quick 5-minute job. Napping stone into a precise, usable edge takes patience, failed attempts, and hours of focused repetition. Exactly the kind of task that fits a rain-bound afternoon. Bone needles, some of the oldest ever discovered, show deliberately drilled eyes fine enough to pass sinew or plant fiber through, essentially prehistoric sewing kits. That detail matters more than it sounds like. Needles mean fitted clothing instead of draped hides, which means better protection against exactly the cold and wet that made the storm dangerous in the first place. The tool created during the crisis solved the crisis. Fiber technology likely emerged the same way, twisting plant material into cordage, rope, essentially. Opened up an enormous range of new possibilities, securing shelter materials against wind, binding tools to handles, building snares for hunting once the weather cleared. Impressions of twisted fiber preserved in ancient clay hint this technology may stretch back tens of thousands of years, born in exactly these long, idle stretches. And bedding wasn't a luxury. It was insulation. Layered leaves, grass, and fur weren't for comfort in the way we think of comfort now. They created dead airspace between a sleeping body and the cold ground, which is a matter of temperature regulation, not coziness. None of this happened because someone announced, "Let's be productive." It happened because sitting still with nothing to do is, for humans, almost unbearable. And the itch to make something with your hands turned enforced boredom into the birthplace of technology. But tools weren't the only thing being shaped in that firelight. Idle hands are only half the story. Idle minds are the other half. And around a fire, with nowhere to go and no one to hunt, minds turn toward each other. This is very likely where storytelling as we know it began to take shape. Not campfire tales for entertainment alone, but survival information passed down in memorable form. Which plants were poisonous, which rivers flooded fastest, which routes led to water. Stories are easier to remember than lists of facts, so knowledge that mattered for survival got wrapped in narrative and repeated until it stuck. It's likely no coincidence that some of humanity's most breathtaking early art appears deep inside caves. Spaces naturally sheltered from weather, spaces you'd retreat to specifically when the outside world was hostile. Elaborate paintings of horses, lions, and aurochs, created with pigments prepared and applied by firelight, represent hours or days of concentrated work. That kind of sustained creative effort requires exactly the conditions a storm provides: shelter, forced stillness, and a group with nowhere else to be. Excavations of processing workshops in coastal caves have uncovered deliberately mixed pigments. Ochre combined with binding agents, stored in shell containers, apparently prepared in advance for later use. That's not incidental scratching. That's intention. Someone planned to make art before they had the free time to do it, which tells us this creative impulse was already established as a valued, repeated activity, not a one-off accident. Painting side by side, telling stories aloud, teaching children by demonstration during the only hours everyone was reliably in one place. This is very plausibly where early human bonding, teaching, and culture building accelerated. Not despite the terrible weather trapping everyone together, but because of it. The storm didn't just test bodies. It built minds, memories, and relationships in ways that pure survival tasks never could. And when the clouds finally broke, all of that, the tools, the rope, the bonded group, was about to pay off. The end of a storm wasn't just relief. It was opportunity. And early humans seemed to know it. Fresh mud and softened ground meant animal tracks stayed crisp and legible far longer than usual, turning the landscape into an open book. Predators, prey, and people alike had been forced into the same shelters during the rain, which meant everyone knew roughly where everyone else had been hiding. Valuable intelligence for a hunt. The rain itself had reshaped the food available. Tubers and roots, softened and easier to dig from saturated soil, became accessible in ways they weren't before. Insect swarms, particularly termites and similar species, often emerge in coordinated waves right after heavy rain. A sudden, concentrated, high-protein food source for anyone who knew when and where to look. And this is the part that matters most. The group stepping back out into the world wasn't the same group that had gone into shelter days earlier. They emerged with new tools shaped in stone, cordage that hadn't existed before the storm, clothing sewn with bone needles instead of simply draped, knowledge passed on in stories that hadn't been told the same way before, a group that had bonded, taught, and created together under pressure. The storm cost them days of hunting and gathering, but it gave them something that arguably mattered more: better equipment, tighter social bonds, and inherited knowledge. Assets that would outlast any single week of bad weather. That trade is the quiet center of this whole story. A crisis that looked, in the moment, like pure loss turned out to be one of the engines that built human culture. So what did ancient humans actually do when it rained for a week? They fought to keep a fire alive because losing it might mean losing everything. They turned enforced stillness into stone tools, needles, and rope. They gathered in firelight and almost without realizing it, invented the earliest versions of storytelling and art. And when the storm finally broke, they walked out changed. Better equipped, more connected, carrying knowledge they didn't have days before. There's a strange comfort in that. The next time you're stuck inside during a storm, restless and bored, staring at a wall, remember that boredom is not new. It's one of the oldest human experiences there is. And for our ancestors, it wasn't wasted time. It was raw material. The tools we still use, the stories we still tell, even the instinct to gather with people we love when the world outside turns hostile. Some of that may trace back to people huddled around a fire, waiting out a storm that felt like it would never end. It always did end, and they were always a little more human for having survived it.